So here we are, another channel Q&A. Thanks so much, as always, for all the absolutely brilliant questions that were asked. As is usually the case, it's just been impossible to answer them all. But I've tried to answer as many as I can, and any that I've left out, I'll try and come back to in the comment section of the questions and provide some answers. So anyway, let's get started. Nabil Al-Hami asks, do you see any possibility of the dissolution of the United Kingdom due to Scottish secession? And related to this, Davidas Yonis asks, in case Northern Ireland and Scotland decide to separate from the UK, is there a possibility for an independent Wales? These are fantastic questions. And as you can imagine, I've really been thinking a lot about what's happening in the UK. It's a bit of a strange time at the moment. I think funnily enough, there was a greater sense, if you like, of imminence of the potential breakup of the UK maybe a year ago than there is now. I think at the height of everything that was happening with Brexit, there was a real discussion about this. And that actually continued into this year and right up until the Scottish parliamentary elections that took place in May. But I think we've now entered a bit of a strange time where the debate seems to have gone a little bit quieter for reasons that aren't entirely clear. And I think it's sort of, for a lot of us who follow this, trying to make some sort of sense of what exactly is happening. I think in broad terms, I mean, the position I've always taken is that when we think about the unity of the United Kingdom, there are obviously the four parts of it. I mean, essentially, we're talking about England as the biggest part, and then Scotland, then you've got Northern Ireland and Wales. And I think a lot of the attention has obviously been put on Scotland and the potential for Scottish independence. And at the same time, we've had this discussion about Ireland and unification. So the north of Ireland, which currently is under British sovereignty, taking a vote and deciding to join with the south, with the Republic of Ireland or Ireland. And this is something that I've always felt run hand in hand. Scotland and Northern Ireland are intrinsically tied to one another, to the point that, you know, if Northern Ireland decides it wants to unite with the rest of Ireland, then I think that it's almost inevitable that Scotland would then follow with independence. Not necessarily immediately, but I think the ball will be rolling. And likewise, if Scotland voted to leave the United Kingdom, I think we would start to see Northern Ireland move in that direction as well. And then Wales sort of falls a little bit behind this. It's always been the case that Wales has a closer relationship, if you like, with England, and specifically England, than obviously Scotland or Northern Ireland. And it's always been the case that Wales seems to have lower levels of support for independence than Scotland or unification in the case of Ireland, Northern Ireland. That seems to have grown in recent years, but it's still unclear how that would develop. And my very personal sense is that if the United Kingdom is to break up, then it would the impetus for that would come from either Scotland or Northern Ireland. But once that starts to happen, I think that if we saw Irish unification followed by an independent Scotland, I think the debate for an independent Wales would grow, and it would grow significantly. We've already seen quite a large jump in range of support in recent years. Still maybe running at about anywhere between 25 and 35%. So it's significantly lower than the sort of the 48% we see for Scottish independence, if not more. But I think then the debate would really be open for Wales. So in broad terms, it's a bit of a difficult question at the moment. I was more thinking in terms of the breakup of the United Kingdom even 6 months ago than I am now. But I mean, you know, these can ebb and flow. And as I say, I think Wales, it really, really does depend on what happens with Scotland and Northern Ireland. Assumations asks, do you think that Taiwan will eventually reunify with China as one country, two systems model similar to Hong Kong? On this one, I think that I probably was more confident about this even 5 years ago than I am today. I think what we've seen happening in Hong Kong with the way that China has really encroached on its special relations and the special administrative system that it was given following the handover from Britain to China, I think has raised real questions now in many people's minds as to whether Beijing can actually be trusted to stand by the agreements that it might have reached. So I don't think that it was particularly likely that you were going to see Taiwan deciding to voluntarily accept unification with the People's Republic of China and hand over, if you like, its claim to the governance of China in return for a very high degree of autonomy similar to that of Hong Kong. But I think that any hope of doing that now looks very, very unlikely indeed. I think a lot of people in Taiwan will have looked at what happened at Hong Kong and just simply said, look, even if we were inclined to try and do this, we just don't feel that we could trust China to stand by its word. And I think that this is one of the bigger problems that we've seen from the way that China's handled Hong Kong, is that it will have created a lot of doubt in people's minds, especially in Taiwan, that this is truly a viable answer. So Uros asks, do you see a viable solution to Serbia-Kosovo issue that can be accepted by both parties? And if so, what does such a solution look like? So I've been working on Serbia-Kosovo for many, many years. And this is, along with Cyprus, one of the two issues I've really spent a lot of time working on from an academic perspective. And we know that Kosovo has got to be addressed in some ways, that the 2008 Declaration of Independence, which was presented at the time, well, this is it, the issue is now solved. It's clearly the case that that didn't actually happen, that although Kosovo has now been recognized by around half the members of the United Nations, its chances of actually joining the UN, its chance of getting recognition by the other half, looks very, very limited indeed. And in actual fact, what we've seen in recent years is a number of de-recognitions, if you like, of countries saying that, well, in actual fact, we recognize Kosovo as an independent country, but on reflection, we believe that it still comes under Serbia's sovereignty and will do so until the sides can reach a negotiated settlement. So there's still this sense that some sort of deal has got to be reached. The question is, what sort of deal is possible? I'm not particularly convinced that this has been handled very well. I think on a number of levels that there hasn't been a lot of realism about the situation. I think, in many cases, the European Union has rather felt that, look, if we lean on Serbia, at some point it'll cave in. And at one point, to be fair, it was looking that might eventually succeed. But I think we've seen a number of geopolitical changes, especially over the past 6 or 7 years, since Crimea, since what Russia did in Ukraine, that has really rewritten the landscape. And I think for countries like Serbia, that although it still professes a desire to join the European Union, doesn't feel that that's the be-all and end-all, and has opened up a geopolitical space, if you like, for Russia and China. I think that hope that the process of EU accession will naturally lead Serbia in the direction of accepting Kosovo's independence isn't necessarily the case anymore. And I think that there does need to be some serious thinking about what a viable settlement would be. Now, a few years ago, there was a very controversial proposal for some sort of land swap or border demarcation or territorial adjustment, whatever you call it. And this was vehemently opposed by a number of countries, including Britain and Germany. But I think, like many others, and including some countries, some European countries, I'd always felt that this was something that should potentially be explored. Now, there's all these arguments that, this will be dangerous, it'll open up precedents. I just never felt that was really the case. I think in many ways what we saw in 2008 could potentially have opened up a precedent, perhaps not as much in reality as many of us might have expected, but I do think that we crossed a certain boundary in international relations in 2008, and I think it's created certain problems that we now have to deal with. And if this possibility of reaching a negotiated settlement between Belgrade and Pristina that might have seen some sort of territorial adjustment, if that was the way to solve the Kosovo issue, then I certainly didn't believe that was contrary to international law. And if it was a consensual agreement that ideally would have been confirmed in the referendum, then I think it could have worked. But it was rejected. And I think that what we've seen now is a slipping back into this very absolute position that can't happen. It's got to be a negotiated settlement. And I'm just not seeing the political will to reach that negotiated settlement, either in Belgrade or in Pristina. And I have to be honest, at the moment, I think that Pristina is probably the greater problem. That there's a new government now that is in power in Pristina, which I think takes a very absolutist position. And I think that this is making any sort of negotiated settlement where you're likely to see some sort of meeting of halfway more and more difficult. So I don't know where Kosovo is going to go, but I'm not particularly optimistic just at the moment. So ASEN, the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, asks, do you know of any modern cases of secession or secessionist movements that aren't based on national, ethnic, or similar identity? So before I go any further, I should say that ASEN is a fantastic organisation for those interested in these issues, and I put a link to their channel above. Do you know, this is a really great question. I was trying to scratch my head at, are there any sort of secessionist movements that aren't based on ethnic, linguistic, perhaps even religious basis? And it's very, very difficult to think of any. I've really tried to wrap my brain. I'm really hoping this isn't a trick question for you and you sort of pop up in the comment section, oh, but there is this really obvious one that you missed, and I'll go, yeah, I think, do you know what? None spring to mind. One that I think is terribly interesting, though, is Transnistria. And this is, as I mentioned, something that I'll look into, because for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, Transnistria has tried to is a de facto state, a breakaway territory from Moldova, and it's essentially a very thin strip of territory that is essentially protected by Russian troops. And there's a sense that this is a Russian enclave in Moldova, and Moldova is predominantly Romanian speaking. And so there is a sense that it's an ethnic dispute. But of course, actually, when you look into it, it isn't really. That the demographic situation in Transnistria is far more complex than that. And that, yes, there is a large Russian-speaking community, but there's also a large Romanian-speaking community. And that it's not quite as clear-cut as saying that this is just a Russia-Moldovan dispute as some might like to think that it is. So I think that that's a really interesting case where it's you've got a separatist situation that isn't clearly defined by cut and dry ethnic or religious or linguistic divisions. But in terms of something else, no, I can't think of any. I do keep meaning to come back and do a video on an independent London, which a number of people have asked me for. And I actually did a little bit of work on this a number of years ago, and I really, really do want to do a video on this. And that would be a fascinating story, because, of course, that really wouldn't be an ethno-linguistic or ethno-national movement. I mean, London, for anyone who knows London, knows that in actual fact it's rather the opposite. It would be almost a collection of people deciding that they want to stand apart from the majority ethnic group, but not identifying themselves as a particular ethnic group, or not yet. Could we be seeing the creation of a London identity? And I when I pulled that face, I wasn't necessarily meaning that I was completely opposed to this idea in any and all circumstances. As a born Londoner, born and bred Londoner, who's grown up in London and lives here in London, I was about to say I have a bit of sympathy for it. I don't know if I do, but it's a fascinating idea. So that could potentially be something a little bit different. So Tim Northrup says, there are several places in the world where colonial borders and their ramifications are just catastrophic or have been over time. Could there ever be a process that would allow for the reimagination of some of these states? So Tim, thanks so much for a brilliant question. And this is a topic and an issue that I thought about so much, because it comes up in so many of the videos that I do, especially on Africa, where we do see this catastrophic legacy of the period of colonization, decolonization, the idea of border changes, borders, being sacrosanct, can't have those redrawn, even though we know that in many cases they don't make a lot of sense, or groups were divided between two states, and in some cases what we would see is one would be francophone, one would be anglophone, and the implications of this. But again, it's so difficult to see how we can reinvent the international system at the moment that would allow us to come up with a way of reimagining these situations, that countries just so jealously guard their sovereignty and they aren't willing to open up this debate. And we see a lot of solidarity, for example, in Africa about this, that the states say, well, look, we may have an internal problem, but we don't want anyone interfering in that. And so we won't interfere in their problems, even if their problems look, we can see a logical solution to it. So I think that this really does hit at a huge, huge issue in international relations. But sadly, I just don't see that we're going to see any reimagining of this, or debate on how to address these colonial borders at any point in, I would say in the foreseeable future. So a few brilliant questions on wider issues of international relations. And Arif Verdaus asks, what would be your advice to somebody who plans to take a master's degree in international relations? And linked to this, Daniel Edelstein asks, as somebody else who's infatuated with geopolitics and international law, what are some of the career paths you could recommend for those sharing your interests? Thanks so much for both those questions, because it really, there are so many options for careers that use international relations. So, I was really interested in pursuing an academic career, but also, I worked in think tank consultancy, even in government. So there are so many career opportunities that are open to you. And so I think that international relations is actually just a really good broad degree and masters to take. But even then, I think it's still very broad indeed. And so I think for anyone who might be interested in looking at doing a degree or a master's degree in international relations, is really think a little bit more about where your interests lie. What you think you might like to do at the end of it. Are you interested in pursuing a career in government? In which case you might be interested in more looking at questions to do with diplomacy and international law. Whereas, for example, you might be interested in sort of pursuing a career where you're interested in business, and international business and international relations could be useful for that. So, for example, political risk analysis, but also just understanding, more international political economy. Some might want to pursue careers in non-governmental sector or for international organizations, where it might be really useful to have an idea of international development or questions to do with human rights and conflict. So really, I mean, it's such a broad field with so many different areas to look into that I'd really recommend, I mean, I think international relations is a fantastic degree. I think it's really useful. And it's just a fantastic way of looking at the wider world. But it is really worth considering, where your career interests might lie, and also where your specific interests within the broad field of international relations might lie. So I think those would really be my key points, I think, for anyone who might be considering looking at a career in international relations. So Chris Green asks, is there a single book, textbook, that you would recommend to an avid follower of your channel? And similarly, Max Bourseau asks, what books are on your shelf, and do you have any recommendations for international relations? If there was just one book that I would really recommend to anyone who's interested in the channel and international relations more broadly, it would be The Creation of States in International Law by James Crawford. Very, very sadly, James Crawford, who was a renowned professor of international law and was a former justice on the International Court of Justice, so one of the most eminent practitioners of international law as well, died just a few months ago, a very, very highly respected Australian. And I would say that book it's international law, so you're going to get things from a legal point of view. But I really feel that for what I do in international relations, the crossover with international law is very, very close. And it's really not possible to talk about secession, independence, recognition without being really, really aware of the legal implications of it. It's one of those areas, I say, where international relations and international law really do come close together and can't be discussed without reference, I think, to each other. So I would, I'd really say more than any other book, that would be my go-to. That would be the book that I'd really recommend. I mean, it's a really hefty and incredibly interesting text. But I'd say if there was just one book I'd really recommend to people, that would be it. In terms of other books, where do I start? There's just so many. I think the ones I'd have on my shelf. So just up there. For example, Hersch Lauterpacht's book on recognition, written in the late 1940s, the key text for recognition. I mean, obviously a lot has happened since then, but this was really the starting point, and I think, has to be there. I think, a book on recognizing states by my dear friend Mickey Fabry, who I'm working on a book with at the moment, and it will one of these days come out. We're trying to get it finalized at the moment. Is a fantastic study on the history of recognition and how it's evolved. So, I would say that that's really, really worth a look. As I say, the book that Mickey and I are working on at the moment, secession and state creation, what everyone needs to know. I've got a permanent link in the description of my videos. Again, I hope it'll be out. I think in many ways touches on a lot of the themes that we talk on in the channel, and hopefully will be a really accessible introductory text but for anyone interested in these issues. So look, there's so many more that I could refer to, but in the absence of favoritism, to talk about it. I think, as I say, the James Crawford book, if there was just one book that I would really recommend, that would have to be it. So I had some really great questions on how do I make videos. And so, for example, Pavle Lazarevich asks, how much research do you do for your videos and how do you do it? So, Pavle, thank you so much for this. I do a lot of research for the videos. I really try and delve into background material for it. I love going through archives, and more is now electronically available, which is great. And what you'll find in a lot of my videos is I'm going back and consulting UN documents, not only, for example, Security Council resolutions, but in a lot of cases, especially at the time of decolonization, there were all sorts of UN missions that were sent off to places to do background research and analysis that then would report back to the Security Council, the General Assembly. And I really do try and look into those documents, and it gives a fascinating insight into a lot of the thought processes that were taking place at the time. And I do try and use, reputable sources, trustworthy news sources obviously are very important, when putting together videos. But I'd say that a lot of research goes into the videos that I do. Occasionally mistakes will crop in. It happens to everyone. I try and minimize that, and wherever possible, try and cross-check information. To say, right, okay, this is what this source says. Is there another reputable source that would back that up? And I mean, in many ways, a lot of this is my academic background, where I'm very used to sort of looking through documents and trying to say, right, okay, is this a credible document? So I think, what I would say is that a lot of research goes into these videos. They aren't thrown together. In some cases, it takes a very long time to write the script. It's very intensive. And it also takes a lot of editing, because I don't want to be making half-hour, 1-hour videos on topics. Part of me would love to do it, but I realize that these are sort of introductions to subjects, so have got to be kept sort of fairly brief. So very often I have a massive amount of research, and then I have to look and try and condense it into the shorter scripts. And again, not, sometimes I might cut out information that, in retrospect, I'd say perhaps I should have kept there. But on the whole, I hope I get the right balance. So Stepanov Takyov asks, which video of yours is your favorite? This is the point when I'm meant to say, well, I'm not meant to have favorites, and things. I love them all. But of course, you do look back and you think, oh, that one wasn't particularly great. And sometimes it can be technical questions. Anyone else who's done videos will tell you that lighting and sound can be really, really difficult to get right. And there are videos I look back and I think, oh God, the lighting was just completely off on that one. Or that the room sound really horribly echoey. So there are those, and that you go back and look at. But in terms of a particular favorite, in terms of subject matter, I think in many ways my favorite is the video I did on Western Togoland, simply because this was such an obscure topic that there was next to no information about, and yet once I started to dig and discovered UN documents, I realized that this was essentially a really interesting subject that at one point had been far better known and far more significant, but has been really forgotten by the passage of time. So even most sort of historians of decolonization, even most historians of British decolonization would be hard pressed to tell you much about Western Togoland. And yet it was such an interesting story. And trying to piece it together. And there was one particular element that didn't make sense to me, which is why Togo at one point was much more in favor of unification with Western Togoland and why it isn't anymore. And it was only by digging around and actually coming across a really fascinating podcast with a Togolese journalist who was talking about the political development of Togoland, of Togo, that answered that question. And it was a real light bulb moment. And it was one of those really fantastic moments when you do research, where you've got a puzzle and you don't quite know, something's happened, but you don't know why. And then bang, that's it. I've heard, yep, that answers it. And that came up in the Western Togoland video. So that I would say is a particular favourite of mine, simply because it was such an unknown subject, and it really required digging around. And then after I'd done all this digging, it presented me with this huge why did this happen? The final piece of the puzzle, digging around some more and finding the answer in a really obscure source, and it all just coming together. So Western Togoland is, I still say, probably my favorite video, just in terms of the research process that went into it. So if you haven't seen it, please do take a look at it. Thanks. So a great question from channel member Anirudh Parthasarathi. A lot of the topics you cover are very sensitive. How do you handle comments clearly made in bad faith that mostly ignore facts and peddle a nationalist narrative? Anirudh, thanks so much for this, because in fact, this is something that I've really been thinking about a lot, and it's becoming more and more of a problem. There's no doubt about it. I've tried as much as possible to encourage a more thoughtful approach to comments on the channel. And by and large, I think certainly amongst those of you who are regular viewers, channel members in your case, or subscribers who come back, and, I get so many brilliant comments, questions. There's so much great discussion that goes on, really considered. And this is why I set up the channel, to try and encourage this. But as inevitably the case, the more the channel becomes known, the more you have people who are unfamiliar with it, who come in, who might make sort of very crude comments, abusive comments, and it's really sad to see, and really disappointing. I don't, by natural inclination, believe in censorship. I don't like deleting comments. I will do if they're abusive. And I'm trying to think of ways of trying to encourage a more civilized debate. And I think in many cases, what I would say is also that, I find, the slogans particularly tiring. So if I do a video on the Balkans and somebody just wants to come in and say Kosovo, yes, Serbia, and what have you contributed to the discussion? So if it's a video on Albanian unification, which I did, what I really appreciated were the Serbs who would sort of come in and, instead of just chanting a slogan or throwing a slogan, would actually say, well, look, I can see why they want it, but this is still what we would consider our sovereign territory. How is this meant to be able to happen? But we can't then have unification with Republika Srpska. Who at least come in and try and elaborate a debate on the subject. And then when somebody comes back and says, well, look, because this, then a give and take, to try and find some sort of middle ground on the debate. This is really what I'd love to see happening more on the channel. I do really try and encourage that, but unfortunately you are just going to get people who do that. And again, look, if it's really abusive, I'll delete the comment. If it's perpetually abusive, then I'll block people. I really don't take any satisfaction in doing it, but I think it's important. And I do want to try and create a better space for viewers to engage in that debate. Now, there are a number of other routes that I could take. Channel membership is one, and Anirudh, thank you very much for having joined. I appreciate it. And I am actually sort of thinking maybe there is an opportunity to sort of develop this for channel members, so that there is a place where we can talk about this. But I don't want to entirely move in that direction, because I do think it's important for others to be able to sort of engage in these debates. There's opportunities for maybe setting up Discord servers, things I'm looking at to try and do that. But I don't want to hand over the comment space to a free-for-all, because I've decided I'm going to vacate it and do the chats with regular viewers somewhere else. I just really don't want to. But again, I do want to highlight that I'm incredibly grateful for how many brilliant comments that I get week in, week out from people, especially the regular viewers. You know who you are. Thanks so much for that. So on a final question, Roger Darthwell asks, what's my favorite radio station and TV channel? So I don't actually tend to listen to a lot of radio, and actually, like a lot of other people, I watch less and less TV. I mean, I'll watch series, but I tend to, you know, and as a good YouTube creator myself, I watch a lot of YouTube. So, you know, in many cases, I'll watch a lot of the channels on making videos. So, you know, there's a lot of brilliant channels out there for anyone who's interested in maybe starting their own channel. Be aware of how much work goes into it, but it is in so many ways incredibly fulfilling. You know, so people like Catherine Manning, Roberto Blake, Nick Nimmin, Brian G. Johnson. You know, these are absolutely brilliant. One that has taken off amazingly recently is a channel called Film Booth, which I'm a huge fan of. And Ed, who runs that, has had some fantastic tips for this channel. So, you know, big shout out to him. But, you know, I love physics. I was rubbish at maths. So my hopes of ever being a physicist, it was never going to happen. But even now, you know, from the very small to the huge, from quantum to, you know, the universe, I just love physics channels. You know, and people like Anton Petrov, I'll very often at night listen to his, and you know, he I don't know how he does it, but he really top quality research on the latest developments in sort of physics. And, you know, so that's a regular one. PBS Space Time, Fermilab. You know, these are channels that I absolutely adore and will often watch. There are obviously the IR channels. I'll talk about those in another video. But there's also other channels which just, you know, general interest that, you know. So, for example, one channel that I've been meaning to give a huge shout out to for ages is George Blonsky. And George makes the most incredible wildlife videos, very often from Southeast Europe, so a particular area that, you know, I'm interested in academically, but absolutely beautiful. And some of the most relaxing videos. So if anyone, you know, who's watching, who's made it this far, wants to, you know, just wants to watch just somebody out in nature filming beautiful scenes and talking about the process of putting together videos of that site, I really would recommend George's channel, and I'll put a link in the description below, and I'll try and put one above. So, you know, those are just some of the channels that I love to watch. But of course, you know, so much of the time is taken consuming news that, you know, I try and, you know, where I can watch some of these other videos. But anyway, I hope that answers the question. So look, this brings us to the end of another really long Q&A, much longer than I expected and anticipated. I promised myself I was going to keep it really short this time. It's ended up being another really long one. Thanks so much for bearing with it. And I look forward to seeing you in one of the regular videos, hopefully next week. Thanks so much.